Chapter 5. The examination was seemingly over. The men were signaled to resume their clothing and helmets. Then the door was opened, and they were permitted to emerge. Their examiners followed, bringing the vials of blood and removing the masks which had been worn for protection in that specially prepared atmosphere. Many of the dwarfs in the outer room thronged curiously around and seemed to be questioning the examiners. These beings, however, were intent on some purpose of their own, and gave brief answers to the inquiries as they led Volmar and Roverton through the clustering laboratory workers and down a hall where the customary red flames that illumined the building were succeeded by others of a cold lunar blue. Their destination proved to be a circular apartment with similar lighting. Here 12 dwarfs were gathered, as if to await the Earthmen and their conductors. All were the usual type in regard to size, formation, and markings, with the exception of 2 who appeared to represent a cruder and more primitive tribe of the same race, with duller coloring and less finely developed proboscides and antennae. Most of them were seated on spidery-looking stools arranged in a semicircle. Some were armed with anesthetic rods, and others carried instruments or weapons that consisted of thin, ebon-black shafts with glowing cones of a cold green fire, possibly radioactive, at one end. The 2 who suggested an aboriginal type were standing, and neither carried any weapon or implement. Near them was a little table on which hypodermics and other instruments were displayed.
"What's all this? Another test?"
muttered Roverton. "We'll soon see." 2 of the examiners, each bearing one of the vials of human blood in his delicate, sinuous fingers, came forward and conferred with the seated beings. Then, by the former, 2 crystal hypodermics were filled with blood from the vials. Their bearers approached the aboriginals, who maintained a stolid and indifferent air, and proceeded to puncture the abdomens of their ant-shapen bodies with the fang-like needles and inject the blood till the hypodermics were empty. All the assembled beings looked on in attentive silence, like a medical conclave. Volmar and Roverton, fascinated and a little horrified by this mysterious experiment, were unable to speak.
"Trying it on the dogs, eh?"
Roverton finally whispered. Volmar made no answer, and the words had barely passed Roverton's lips when the 2 aboriginals suddenly lost their impassivity and began to leap and twist as if in terrible pain. Then they fell to the floor with vehement cries that were half hisses, half shrieks. Both were swelling visibly, as if from the effects of some deadly poison, and the dull-hued integument of their bodies was blackening moment by moment. The injected venom of 100 cobras could not have produced a more immediate or more appalling result. "Who could have imagined that?" said Volmar, in low tones of dismay and consternation.
"It certainly looks as if human blood didn't mix very well with the life fluid of these creatures."
Roverton was too horrified to make any further or crisper comment. The convulsions of the agonized victims were lessening by ghastly degrees, and their cries grew fainter, like the hiss of dying serpents. Their heads, bodies, and even their antennae were puffed beyond recognition, and had turned to a putrid purple black. With a few final spasms and twitches, they lay still and did not stir again.
"Oh, I hope the doctors are satisfied with their experiment."
It was Roverton who spoke. He and Volmar tore their eyes away from the ghastly sight on the floor in time to see that one of the seated conclave members had risen and was moving toward them, lifting, as he came, the ebon shaft with fiery terminal cone which he carried. The use of this implement, the nature of the cold green flame, and the purpose of its bearer were all equally uncertain. As the men afterwards reflected, the dwarf's intentions were not necessarily hostile, and may have been those of mere curiosity. but their nerves were on edge with all the cryptical, uncanny adventures and experiences they had gone through, and following on the hideous outcome of the experiment they had just beheld, the sudden movement of the dwarf was fraught with connotations of unknowable menace. Roverton, who stood a little in advance of Volmar, sprang to one side before the dwarf and seized the fragile-looking table that was supported on tarantula-like legs. Hypodermics, vials, and other utensils of an unknown medical art clattered on the floor as he lifted the table and held it in front of him like a shield. Then, facing the suspected assailant, he began to retreat toward the open door with Volmar at his side. The dwarf, it would seem, was puzzled or confounded by this action for an instant. He paused, then came on with a loud, sibilant cry, waving his weapon. His confreres, rising from their seats in a body, also followed, and ran to intercept the men before they could escape from the room. Their movements were quick as the darting of angry insects. Swinging the table aloft, Roverton hurled it in the face of his attacker. The creature was beaten down, releasing the lambent-headed wand as he fell, and it shot forward and dropped at Roverton's feet. In a flash, Roverton picked it up, and he and Volmar sprang for the door. Two dwarfs, fleeter than the others, had managed to head them off and were standing on the threshold. Both were armed with the familiar anesthetic rods. Not knowing the properties of the implement which he had snatched from its fallen bearer, but surmising that it must have some efficacious use, Roverton charged the two beings in the doorway. His superior length of arm enabled him to smite one of them on the breast with the green cone, while he himself avoided their paralyzing weapons. The effect of his blow was amazing and terrific. The glowing cone, whatever it was, seemed to burn an instant way through the bodily substance of the dwarf like white-hot iron in butter. The creature fell dead, with a dark and gaping hole in his bosom, and Roverton, surprised and thrown off his balance, barely evaded the outflung rod of the other. However, with a deftness that would have done honor to a professional swordsman, he swerved his weapon, almost continuing its initial movement, and smote the body of the second dwarf, who went down beside the first. All this had occurred in a mere fraction of time, and a split second of faltering or a single misstep would have been fatal. The Earthmen leapt across the fallen bodies and cleared the threshold just in time to evade the main group of their pursuers. They were in a long corridor, wholly deserted for the nonce, which led on one hand to the huge room of monster cages, and on the other to parts as yet unknown. They chose the latter direction. Their situation was irredeemably desperate, and even if they could escape from the building, they would find themselves hemmed in at every turn by the perils and pitfalls of a world inevitably hostile to human life through its very strangeness. But after their captivity and the queer ordeals to which they had perforce submitted, it was good to move freely again, even though their flight could only end in recapture or the unconceived horror of some strange death. They sprinted down the corridor with a dozen dwarfs at their heels, and found that their longer legs would enable them to distance their pursuers by degrees. At intervals they met others of the laboratory attendants, mostly unarmed, who all leapt back in obvious terror before the lethal wand that Roverton brandished in their faces. The Earthmen also encountered a sleepy-looking monster, like a sort of wingless dragon, which was probably a pet. It was lying stretched across the hall, and it gave a torpid and protesting bellow as they hurtled its spiny back and continued their flight. The corridor, lit by unwavering rubescent flames, ran straight for an interminable distance, and then turned at a sharp angle. Through open doors on either side, the fleeing Earthmen caught outlandish glimpses of incomprehensible activities. Again, the corridor turned at a reverse angle, and its ruddy flames were succeeded by the glaring mauve of daylight. Volmar and Roverton emerged on a narrow balcony as the ever-swelling swarm of their pursuers came in sight. Before them again was the vast, bewildering vision of the White City, with its web of alabaster bridges woven gossamer-wise between buildings that were alabaster mountains with multi-angled scarps and strange pinnacles. It was noon in this world, for the sun, which they knew as an unnamed star in Serpens, poured down from a vertical elevation the cruel and tyrannic splendor of its supertropic beams to illumine the vertigo-breeding depth of the chasmal streets below. The balcony, or ledge, was barely 7 feet in width, and like all others in this preternatural architecture, was void of walls or railings. Doubtless it circled the whole edifice, and at frequent intervals there were bridges which connected it with the balconies of other mammoth piles. Blinded by the glare and shrinking from the dreadful gulfs, the men followed the ledge for some distance, but paused in consternation when a horde of dwarfs issued from a doorway just ahead. These beings, it was plain, had been sent to intercept them. The first group of pursuers, which now numbered at least a score, was closing in from behind. There were no accessible doors or windows by which to re-enter the building, and the only means of continuing their flight was to cross one of those appalling bridges.
"Here goes!"
cried Roverton, panting, as he led the way along the slender span. The bridge was unoccupied, but it seemed preferable that he, being armed, should go first in case of possible opposition. It was a mad race. The men dared not slacken their speed, for their pursuers, two abreast, were crowding the bridge behind them like ants. The danger of being overtaken gave them an added coolness and poise, and they ran with flying leaps on a path where even the least indecision or miscalculation might have plunged them into the abyss. They were nearing the opposing pile when 3 dwarfs, armed with the paralyzing rods, emerged from a door in its cyclopean mass and ran forward to meet them on the bridge. Holding his own weapon like a lance, Roverton faced these beings without hesitation. It was a perilous combat, for 2 of them were side by side, and he could dispose of only one at a time. He struck and parried with lightning agility, and the 2, with yawning holes in their thoraxes from the impact of the fearsome igneous cone, went down in swift succession and hurtled into the half-mile chasm beneath. The 3rd, however, had advanced within reach of Roverton and thrust viciously with his rod. Roverton dodged, and would have lost his footing as he teetered within an inch of the verge, if Volmar, standing close behind, had not put out an arm to steady him. Missing, the 3rd dwarf ran headlong upon Roverton's weapon, which pierced him through till his body hung impaled on the ebon shaft. Roverton disengaged it, and kicked the falling corpse aside to join its companions in the gulf. The Earthmen reached the opposite building without further interruption, but their pursuers had gained appreciably during the combat, and were dogging them closely as they plunged into the new edifice. This building, as far as they could tell, was wholly deserted, and it differed materially in its furnishings and apparent use from the one they had left. The unpeopled rooms into which they glanced as they hurried along a main hall were paneled with fantastic paintings and designs that might have been astronomical maps. In some of them there were huge globes and hemispheres of metal, and appliances like alien cosmospheres and planispheres. An angle of the hall took the men temporarily beyond sight of their pursuers.
"Quick, let's find a hiding place or a stairway," whispered Roverton.
They hesitated before a little door which gave on a dark chamber where the beams of the red fires in the hall were powerless to penetrate. Then, in an alcove, they perceived a flight of stairs. Trusting that their pursuers would continue along the corridor, they began to ascend the stairs, taking 3 or 4 of the tiny steps at a leap. They would have preferred to descend, with the hope of eventually finding themselves on some sort of terra firma, but were deterred by an inexplicable noise, a metallic whirring and jarring that suddenly started on the floors below. Above, there was utter silence.
"Haven't these people any elevator systems?"
asked Roverton, after they had climbed steadily for several minutes.
"It must take them all eternity to go up and down in their skyscrapers like this."
There may be some other method of transit, though probably it wouldn't be of any use to us without special knowledge regarding its mechanism. For hours, it seemed, the Earthmen toiled from story to story of that interminable edifice. The sounds of pursuit had died out, and apparently the dwarfs were still seeking them on lower levels. They met no one in all that endless range of red-lit stairs and rooms. All had grown silent, except for the subterranean rumblings from beneath the city, which became fainter as they went upward. They must have been in the heart of the building, and at no time did they approach the outer rooms and balconies, or attain even a far-off glimpse of sunlight. They ceased to count the number of floors they had ascended, and it seemed to them that they were lost in some awful topless tower of eternity and infinity. They marveled at the mania for space and magnitude, which must have prompted this tiny people to rear such colossal structures. Their legs were turning to lead, and each added step was like the heaving of a mighty weight. They gasped for breath within their aerated helmets, and heard the pounding of heavy pulses in their temples like the roar of driven torrents.
"Where are we going anyway?"
questioned Roverton, as they paused for a momentary respite.
"And why are we going there? The end is a foregone conclusion with all the cards that are stacked against us. There must be about 1,000,000 deadly contingencies, I should think. We'll do well if we live long enough to exhaust our present supply of air."
"The air of this particular world might not be fatal to us," said Volmar. "We haven't sampled it yet. If you'll remember, our dwarf friends were considerate enough, evidently, to refill our tanks with a chemical synthesis of the same air that they found in them."
"Well, I'd rather not try the local atmosphere till I have to, but what's the use of climbing any further? We've got the whole planet against us. Probably there are billions of these dwarfs with their devilish chemistry, all of them ready to hunt us down like wild beasts."
"Why worry about a little thing like that? Come on, there should be a good view from the top of this Tower of Babel when we get to it." Following the slow, tedious spiral of the stairs, at length they saw a gleam of purple daylight above them, and came out on the building's roof, where a single central spire continued to escalade the heavens. The flat roof itself was crowded with orb-like mechanisms that were perhaps used for the observations of solar and stellar force. Crystal wheels and spheres were turning silently within larger spheres of the same substance. No one was in sight, and the roof was seemingly unoccupied. But several aircraft were approaching, and fearing to be seen by their occupants, the Earthmen entered a door in the great spire. Here they found a staircase, and resumed their eternal climb. At the top they emerged in a curious open cupola, whose lofty dome was filled with large perforations. The place was lined with instruments that were doubtless astronomical. There were cosmolabes and armillaries designed for a universe not measured heretofore by man. There were strange double and triple mirrors of white mineral with surfaces of baffling convex angles. There were lenses arranged behind each other in curving semicircular frames and adjusted to an unhuman vision. In the center of the alabastren floor, the men perceived a sable disk, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, and depressed about 6 inches below the floor level. From the middle of the disk, and close together, there rose 2 upright rods. At first, they did not see that the cupola was occupied. Then, behind the litter of strange appliances, they perceived a wizened and aged-looking dwarf bowed above a sort of dial on which was slanting rows of rubricated ciphers. He was unarmed, and did not hear the Earthmen till they were close upon him. Then he turned and saw them. Ungovernably startled, it would seem, by the apparition of beings who must have been supremely monstrous from his viewpoint, he darted away from the dial and sprang toward the black disk. Roverton intercepted him, being dubious on general principles regarding the intention of this movement. Terrified by the glowing weapon which the Earthmen waved in his face, the dwarf circled back among the crowded instruments and contrived to elude both Volmar and Roverton and win the head of the stairs. There he disappeared from their ken at breakneck speed.
"Too bad we didn't get him," said Roverton. "I wasn't anxious to hurt that fellow, but now he'll spread the good word among the others as to where we are hiding. The whole pack will be here presently, if not sooner."
"Well, let's take a look at the view, anyway, being as we're here." They stepped to the verge of the open cupola, which was supported on a circle of thin pillars, and looked out on a staggering scene. They could see the whole extent of the mighty city, which reached for many miles in every direction, lying below them at a depth which turned the people in its streets to microscopic motes. Around the city was a landscape of ineffable bizarrerie, with wide canals of blood-red water that intersected each other to form terraced isles, and then wound away through fields and forests of a vegetation whose coloring was more violent than that of futuristic paintings. Beyond it all, in sharp, airless outline on the violescent heavens, were horn-like mountains of jetty black, and others of a whiteness more dazzling than that of Pentelic marble.
"Golly,"
was Roverton's ejaculation,
"the outlook is almost worth the climb, but I'd rather be seeing it from the Alcyone."
There came a confused babble of shrilling voices, and a horde of dwarfs emerged on the roof below them and streamed toward the central spire. "They couldn't have been so very far behind us, after all," Volmar commented, "and of course our friend the astronomer had told them how we invaded his observatory and dispossessed him." Roverton was considering the various instruments in the cupola with an estimating eye. Some of them were set in the floor by means of metal bars and pivots, but many others were detached or loosely mounted. He picked up a singular object consisting of no less than 7 concave lenses framed among rods and wires of a malachite-colored metal. It was satisfyingly heavy and would make an effective missile.
"We can hold the stairs while the ammunition lasts," he said.
Volmar was lifting a small armillary to try its weight. Between them, the men collected everything movable in a great pile at the stair head. They had no sooner finished doing this when the foremost of their pursuers came in sight. The winding steps were packed with these creatures, most of whom were furnished with anesthetic rods, ignatiant wands, and other odd weapons. The men began to hurl their fantastic missiles at the throng, a barrage of metal orbs and mirrors and queer-angled things which may have served the purpose of telescopes, eyeglasses, and spectroscopes. The front rows of assailants were driven back with crushed heads and broken limbs, and many were slain or paralyzed by their own weapons as they went down in a tangled mass that blocked the stairway. In an orderly manner, seemingly unperturbed by all these casualties, the dwarfs proceeded to clear away their dead and wounded, and then came on as before. More were swept down by the remainder of the observatory's detachable paraphernalia, and much havoc, in particular, was inflicted by 2 armillaries, which Volmar raised in his arms and sent crashing into the vanward files. The supply of missiles was now exhausted, but Roverton still retained his death-dealing wand, and Volmar had reserved a sort of lens apparatus which he intended to use as a mace when their attackers came within reach. With the same hideous, unhuman imperturbability, after halting long enough to remove the victims of that final barrage, the dwarfs resumed their advance, while the Earthmen awaited them at the stairhead. Roverton, quick-eared and alert as he watched the thronging onset, was aware of an odd noise from behind, as if something had clashed lightly against the cupola. Turning, he perceived that an air-vessel, shaped somewhat in the fashion of a long, crescent-prowed barge, but without wings or any visible agency of levitation, had attached itself by coiling tendril-like chains to the cupola columns, and was discharging a dozen dwarfs into the observatory. Roverton called Volmar's attention to the new danger.
"If you can hold the stairs, Captain, I'll tend to these customers,"
he said, and sprang to meet the invaders. These latter were furnished with weapons of a kind which the Earthmen had not hitherto encountered, long trumpet-like tubes which they levelled immediately at Roverton. Their curling fingers played on certain knobs which studded the tubes, and from the mouth of each weapon there issued a jet of pearly vapour. All were aiming at Roverton's head, and he surmised that the vapour was some sort of deadly gas or anaesthetic. The goggles of his mask were blinded by the fumes, and he could see nothing as he groped among the strange paraphernalia in the dome. Tripping against some unseen object, and trying to save himself from a fall, he lurched forward and stepped down with a terrific jar on the broad central disc that was set below the floor level. Clear of the pearly fumes, which still played overhead, he saw his assailants for an instant crowding toward him with their weird weapons as he clutched with his free hand at one of the upright rods which rose from the disc. Then he heard Volmar cry out and turned his head toward the captain, jerking the rod involuntarily as he did so. He saw in the merest flash of time that Volmar had fallen and was half hidden by the dwarfs who thronged about him from the stairs. Then the scene vanished, as if a black curtain had rushed upward from it, and Roverton realized that the disc was dropping away beneath him with dizzy velocity in a long, dark shaft.